back to my channel, Beautiful Minutia. If you're new here, my name is Tiffany, and today I am doing the Christmas Carol book tag. This tag is super old. So I actually saw this tag on Very Literary Carrie's channel like a really long time ago. She did this tag literally 4 years ago, and I don't know if Carrie even makes videos anymore. I haven't seen anything from her in a while, but I had saved it because I'm like, oh, this would be a fun one to do for Christmas, and then I just haven't gotten around to it. I've done other Christmas tags or had other ideas for videos, but because I read A Christmas Carol this month and also Mr. Dickens' Carol, it seemed like the perfect time to do a book tag based on A Christmas Carol. This tag was originally created by Lauren Wade. I don't even know how long ago, if Carrie did it 4 years ago, but let's go ahead and dive into the questions. So question number 1 is Ghost of Christmas Past, a book that was a childhood favorite. There's definitely a lot of series that I read as a child, but a book that I've returned to over and over again, and I've mentioned this on my channel like a lot, so this might be a little bit repetitive, but I would always say that my overall favorite childhood book was The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. I just remember reading this on repeat like over and over and over and over again, and being outside and pretending that I was Mary trying to find this secret garden and trying to do these things, and the magic of that book totally captured my imagination as a child. Next question is The Ghost of Christmas Present, a recent book that you think will become one of your all-time favorites. It's hard to say all-time favorite just because, you don't know, especially when you kind of have this recency bias of a book that you recently finished and you're like, oh my gosh, I love it so much. Sometimes over time, it doesn't have the same impact. But I've had very few 5 stars in the past 6 months, which I actually mentioned in the vlog that I just posted last week. And last week I had a new 5-star for the first time since August, and that book is Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan. I could see this becoming an all-time favorite. I could see this being a book that I want to read over and over and over again because it's just so beautifully done, and it's such a reflective book, and it's so tiny, so it's like very accessible to read over and over again. It also takes place during Christmas time, so it felt like a very appropriate Christmas time read, although really you could read it anytime. It's not specifically a Christmas book. It is about a man who is kind of reflecting on his past. He's an illegitimate child, and he's kind of reflecting on how his childhood could have turned out much differently if it weren't for the kindness of people around him. And then his observations on things going on around him, and will he bestow the same kindness and care to others around him that was also given to him when he was young. Again, deeply reflective, really beautifully done, and I loved it. The next question is The Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come, a book coming out next year that you're most excited about. If you've been on my channel for very long, you know I don't read a lot of new releases or pay attention to very many new releases. I think the only one that I was like really excited for this year was Wind and Truth by Brandon Sanderson, because it was the completion of the Stormlight archive, or at least the first arc. So I haven't been paying a ton of attention to books that are coming out next year, but I do know that there is a new Hunger Games book coming out called Sunrise on the Reaping. And I had like kind of mixed feelings of A Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. Is that the title? I think that was kind of like President Snow's backstory, but this is Haymitch's backstory about like when he went to the Hunger Games, and I could see myself like really enjoying this one. I hope so. I really liked the original Hunger Games trilogy. I read it first like when I was like in my early 20s and have reread it a couple of times since then, so I think that I might actually really enjoy this one. So this is a new release coming out in March that I actually might pick up. The next question is Bah Humbug, a book that everyone loves that you just can't stand. My goodness, I have a couple, and they're gonna be probably quite controversial. The first one is The Call of the Wild by Jack London. I know, everyone loves Jack London. I don't. Actually, this is the only one of his I've read. I haven't read White Fang yet, but I really hated The Call of the Wild. It has beautiful writing, but I was just, I guess, hoping for something a little bit more redemptive than this book ended up being, because the entirety of the book just like made me angry. I also really didn't like All Systems Red, which is a sci-fi novella that like everyone loved a few years ago. It was just like making the rounds on BookTube, and everyone was like obsessed with it because it was so funny and so interesting about this robot that was like really sarcastic, and like I didn't really think it was funny, and I just like kind of didn't get it. I'm like, well, I do not understand the hype for this book at all. And lastly is probably the most controversial one because it is a book for book lovers, and that's 84 Charing Cross Road. This is technically a nonfiction because it's letters written back and forth from someone who lives in the United States and a bookseller in London, I think, definitely in England, but I think in London, and they're writing letters back and forth because she's looking for specific books that they have in stock, and the letters go back and forth during World War II, and kind of a friendship develops between these people as they're writing letters to each other. This was possibly the book that made me realize that I don't really like or connect with epistolary novels for the most part. There are exceptions to this, but I just was not invested in the characters. And I had some people tell me, oh, you should listen to the audiobook because there's different, there's different narrators for different people. And I actually did listen to it on audio, and I still just didn't really enjoy it. It was full of like literary references, some of which like totally went over my head. And I just I didn't cry. And I think most people do. And I don't know. I just was not impressed. The next question is Bob Cratchit, an old dependable you always recommend. So this is kind of a tough question because what are people asking for a recommendation for from me? Because that's going to depend on like what your reading tastes are, like what you tell me you want recommendations for. But I often have people ask me for classics recommendations because I do read a lot of classic literature. I have people ask for like Dickens recommendations because they know I'm kind of a Dickens fangirl. So I actually did a video about like where to start with Dickens. So if you're one of those people, you can check out that video. But long story short, one of the books that I typically recommend to people who are intimidated by starting out with Dickens is Great Expectations. Dickens often has like a wide sweeping cast of characters, and he will flop between views a lot of times, and that can make it kind of like overwhelming and hard to figure out like how do these people all know each other, like how is this going to like come together. But Great Expectations is told in first person. David Copperfield is too, and I'm rereading that right now, and I feel like David Copperfield is pretty accessible as well, but Great Expectations is half the length, and so that's why I usually recommend it to people, because it is one of Dickens' shorter works and it is told in first person. And so both of those things I think make it just like a little bit more accessible to get your bearings. I also have people often ask me for recommendations of Russian classics because they know I really love Dostoevsky in particular, but I also love all Russian literature that I've read so far. I also did a video for where to start with Dostoevsky, so if you're interested in that, I'll link that too. But the book that I'm going to recommend for you to start with for Russian literature is actually not a Dostoevsky book, it's a Tolstoy. Tolstoy is known for his very long, meandering stories, especially War and Peace and Anna Karenina, which I find Anna Karenina to be much more accessible than War and Peace, but that's not the one I'm going to recommend to you because it's still over 1,000 pages and it's still pretty intimidating. I'm actually going to recommend one of his novellas to you, and that's The Death of Ivan Ilyich. I recommend this to people all the time. It's, I think, around 50 pages, and it's about a man who's kind of coming to the end of his life, and it's just reflecting on like what does it mean to have a life that is well lived and a life that you don't have regrets when you come to the end. And like when you're looking back at your life, what do you wish it looked like? What does it mean to have lived well? And this was a deeply reflective book for me, and so that's why I loved it so much, but I also find it to be pretty accessible. The next prompt is Tiny Tim, an underhyped book that you think deserves more love. So again, I'm gonna do a couple recommendations for this. So classic that I feel like deserves more love, and can you really say that with classics? I don't know, because if people still know about it and it stood the test of time, then it probably does have some hype. But I think people talk all the time about the Bronte sisters, and the book that they rarely mention is Agnes Grey by Anne Bronte. People talk about The Tenant of Wildfell Hall way more. It has a lot more like historical and cultural impact, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. I feel like Tenant is like a braver book and maybe a more important book given the subject matter, but I think that Agnes Grey is a more enjoyable read, a more happy read, and I enjoyed the story just a lot more. It's a lot shorter, but I still just loved it. It might be my favorite Bronte book, which is also a very controversial take. A middle grade that I think adults should read too, because it's got a lot of really clever, like punny wordplay, but also some like really great moments, is The Phantom Toll Booth. I don't ever hear people talk about this book, which is really a shame, because it's kind of like a children's classic, because I think it was written in the 60s or the 70s. So it's not a new book, and it didn't get lost in the noise of like modern publishing, but like no one talks about this book, and it's so clever. It's about this young boy who's like really bored with life, and he ends up with this toll booth that randomly appears in his room, and he goes off and it takes him to this land of like, there's a land of like letters and a land of numbers, and these two kings are warring against each other because their sisters, who are the princesses called Rhyme and Reason, have been banished from their kingdom. So now there's no more rhyme and reason or wisdom in their kingdom. And so Milo has to kind of try to like go on this journey to bring rhyme and reason back to this country. It's just really cleverly done and amazing, and I love it so much. More people should read it. The next prompt is today, why it's Christmas Day, a book that always gets you in the mood for Christmas apart from A Christmas Carol. So the most obvious choice for me, being a Christian, is actually the Bible, and that's actually even more obvious than A Christmas Carol. Like, I always love reading the different accounts of the birth of Christ in the New Testament from various gospels and seeing different perspectives and different things that each writer was inspired by the Holy Spirit to point out. And so that always gets me in the mood. But I also think that Christmas short stories always get me in the mood, because I don't read the same books every year for Christmas. I typically like to read some classics and stuff like that, but like it just depends year by year. So this year I read Christmas at Thompson Hall by Anthony Trollope, which was like perfectly festive and Christmassy. There was one year that I read a whole bunch of O. Henry Christmas stories, including The Gift of the Magi, which is a classic. Like, probably everyone has read that one, and that was delightful. There have been years that I read Dickens Christmas short stories, and so it just depends on the year. But I find that if I can get my hands on a couple of like Christmas short stories or a Christmas novella, that usually gets me feeling very festive. Lastly is The Muppet Christmas Carol, your favorite film adaptation of a book. Honestly, Muppet Christmas Carol is an absolute masterpiece. I was just talking to some people in my Patreon the other day when we were doing reading sprints, and we were like, they should have made more Muppet classics, because A Muppet Christmas Carol is perfect, Muppet Treasure Island is perfect, and it's always fun to like kind of imagine like if Muppets did this classic book, like there's usually like one person who's like a human character, like Michael Caine as Scrooge, and then the rest of the main cast is Muppets. And so it's funny to think about like, okay, well, if the Muppets redid this book, who would be the one person that stays a human character in this book? Anyways, I digress. But I think actually, truly, my favorite film adaptation is Lord of the Rings. I love the Lord of the Rings movies. I actually do not love the Hobbit movies, and I only watched the first one and was quite disappointed with it. I felt like the Hobbit movies were just like very bloated and very like, had so much stuff added to it, and I was just like, But Lord of the Rings, I feel like they really retained the spirit of the book so perfectly, and I'm always so impressed at like how little CGI is in the Lord of the Rings movies as opposed to the Hobbit. Like, I saw the first Hobbit movie in theaters and actually got motion sick a couple of times with like how intensely CGI some of the scenes were. And Lord of the Rings was like, had so many sets that they built, and so many people had like full makeup and stuff on it. I just find it to be like such a masterpiece. The soundtrack is absolutely incredible. I thought the casting was perfect, and there's just so much about it that is amazing, and there's a reason that those movies have stood up over time and aren't like looked at as cheesy or, you know, poorly done in terms of like special effects and stuff like that. And I just feel like they are so well done, and you can feel the love that Peter Jackson has for the Lord of the Rings. And I think too, I watched the movies when I was very young, so there's definitely nostalgia tinging my view of that. But man, do I love the Lord of the Rings movies. The last question is to tag some people, and because this tag has been around for a long time, it's kind of hard to know who to tag, but I'm gonna tag a couple people, and I know lots of people have Christmas filming plans already, so it's totally fine if you do not do this tag. If you have a channel, you should do this tag if you're looking for some Christmas content, because it feels like the perfect Christmassy tag. Anyways, I'm gonna tag Dia from Novel Idea and Kelly from Kelly Reads a Lot, because they both do lots of tags. So if they're looking for a Christmassy tag, this is perfect. I'm also going to tag a couple of newer channels. M's books are everywhere. I would love to see her answers to this tag. And also my book hauled life, Essie. I would love to see Essie do this tag as well. And if you're watching, I always have the questions of the tag in the description of my video. So if you want to go back and reference them, then you can, and tell me some of your answers. I would especially love to know if you have a recent book you've read that you think would be an all-time favorite, or a book that you think deserves more love because it's underhyped. I'm always kind of like looking for what people's new favorites are and trying to see what people are talking about, or if you have a new release that you're really excited about that's coming out next year, because I know a lot of people kind of like have their ear to the ground for what's coming out, and I am not that person. So I'd be curious to know also what you're excited about that's coming out. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please hit like and also subscribe so you can continue to see more bookish content from me, and I will see you again next time.